All right. Good. Greetings. If you are here for the Covenantal Commandment, the Sabbatical year in the Bible with Rabbi Silber, welcome. Um, this is the second session, and we will be following. We will be using texts in Leviticus 25 and Exodus 34. If you have your preferred Chumash, you are welcome to follow along. Otherwise, we will share texts in the chat and in the screen. If you're watching in Zoom, you are welcome to and certainly encouraged to ask questions. You can always throw questions in the chat and I'll read them out during breaks. Or when Rabbi Silber pauses, raise your hand or use the raise hand function to get his attention. If you are following along in Facebook Live, please type your questions into the chat and we will happily, not or at least I will happily read your question into there. Rabbi Silber, welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I had mentioned, we began last week, and I mentioned that Shemitah appears in the Torah in 4 places. One place it appears at great length, which is in chapter 25 of Vayikra. But actually, whether it appears in the Torah 4 places or 5 places is a question. And specifically, last week we saw chapter 23, and we talked a bit about the presence of Shemitah in chapter 23 of Shemot, which is part of what the Torah calls the Sefer HaBrit, the book of the covenant. And Shemitah appears towards the end of that important section. It's really part of the whole experience of being at Sinai. So that's one place it appears. And then we jumped to chapter 25 of Vayikra, but I did want to point out that there is another verse actually in the Chumash, and it's a question as to what that verse refers. And specifically what I'm referring to is in chapter 34 of Shemot. For example, let's start with verse number 18, just by way of introduction. So chapter 34 there's a section in chapter 34, which actually begins chapter 34, I would say verse number 11. This is a section of laws, a briefer section of laws, which is present after Moshe receives the Torah a second time. Moshe has prayed to God. God reveals the attributes of mercy, Yud Gimel Midot, and then God agrees to give Moshe a second set of tablets. And then we have in the Torah a set of commandments, beginning in chapter 34, verse number 11, and it goes all the way to chapter 34, verse number 26. That's in section. And it's interesting, it's shorter than the previous longer section of chapters 21, 22, 23, but it's interesting what's here. So the first piece of it, which we're not going to get into, beginning in verse 11, are commandments concerning idolatry, not to worship any gods, not to make covenants with people that will cause you to worship other gods. Do not make a covenant. Do not make a molten image, which of course harks back to the golden calf. And then we have a few more commandments, and it's interesting what the Torah has chosen to include. It begins in verse number 18 with the observance of Pesach, what the Torah calls Chag HaMatzot, and Chag HaMatzot Tishmar. So we have the festival of what we call Pesach, the Torah calls Chag HaMatzot, to observe it in the month of Aviv, okay? Then there's, in verses 19 and 20, there are laws concerning the firstborn of animals, the firstborn of humans, people. It talks about the end of verse 20, not appearing before God empty-handed. And then we have chapter 34, verse number 21. So let's take a look at that verse. Pasuk Kaf Aleph, verse 21. And the Torah says, Sheshet Yamim Tavod, Uvayom Hashvi'i Tishbot, Bechorish Uvakotzir Tishbot. So it translates 6 yamim. We'll see what yamim means. You work. On the 7th, you rest. Becharish uvakotzir tishbot. You should rest at the time of plowing and the time of harvest. And now the question is, what is that referring to? Just to take note of the fact, and we'll come back to this later, that this prohibition, 6 yamim you shall work, and the 7th rest, in the time of harvesting, a time of plowing, literally, and harvesting. The next verse says, "V'chag Shavuot taseh lecha bikurei katzir chitim." You shall observe the festival of Shavuot. So this verse, number 21, is sandwiched between the laws relating to Pesach and the attendant law of the firstborn. Because, of course, on Pesach in the Torah, there was the story of the Makat Bechorot. And right after, we have this rule about the 6 Yamim. We have Shavuot. So between Pesach and Shavuot, the 2 holidays that are connected to each other, we have a verse that seems completely out of place, and that is 6 Yamim shall you work. The 7th you shall rest at the harvest time, at the time of plowing. So here we have a dispute actually in the Talmud, and Rashi brings both opinions, and the commentaries discuss what is the plain meaning of the Torah. So most of the commentaries assume that the plain meaning of the Chumash, the Ibn Ezra, the Ramban, and it would appear to be so, that Sheshet Yomim Tavod means 6 days. You may work, you are permitted to work for 6 days, but on the 7th day, Bayom HaShvi'i, Tishbot, on the 7th day you cease from work, 7th day being Shabbat, Tishbot, and the end of the verse, Bechorish uvakotzir Tishbot, rest at the time of plowing and the time of harvest, is taken to mean that harvesting and plowing are 2 of the prohibited labors on Shabbat. And these are 2 examples that the Torah gives. In fact, the Rashbam comments on this phrase, Bechorish uvakotzir Tishbot. The Rashbam comments, even at the time of Charish and Kotzir, even at a time when you might think, it's a time of harvest, so let the person harvest, otherwise he may lose his livelihood. At the time of that season when everybody's harvesting or plowing. So even at that time, says the Rashbam, the Torah forbids work on Shabbat, and certainly other kinds of labor, which there's less pressing need for, is certainly prohibited. That's what most of the commentaries say, and Rashi has one opinion, that Sheshet Yamim, that Yamim means days. It's days. Of course, the question would be, in any event, why it is where it is, in between Pesach and Shavuot. But 6 days you shall work, 7th you shall rest, at the time of harvest, at the time of plowing. There is, however, another opinion. And the reason I wanted to look at this verse now is because there is an opinion that Sheshet Yamim Tavod Uvayom HaShvi'i Tishbot, that Yamim doesn't mean days over here, but rather Yamim means years. And we do have examples. The word Yom, it means a time, a certain amount of time. Typically it's days, but Yamim can also mean years. And then the translation of the verse would be, you may work for 6 years, but on the 7th year you shall rest. Becharish uvakotzir tishbot, rest at the time of harvest. Don't work your fields at the time you would normally plow the field, and don't harvest the crop at the time you would normally harvest the crop. In fact, the Gemara, actually Talmud Yerushalmi, and it's found in the Bible as well, understands Bechorish uvakotzir tishbot to be saying that you shall rest during the 7th year, which is Shemitah, and not only shall you rest during the 7th year, but you should even rest in some kind of period of time which precedes the Shemitah year. And Rashi brings that opinion. It's what we have a parallel in Shabbat, we call Tosefet Shabbat, or Yom Kippur, to add on part of the weekday to the Shabbat. So we're lighting the candles 18 minutes before Shabbat. We want to add on to the Shabbat. We want to add on to the end of Shabbat. So the Mishnah would seem to the Mishnah suggests that such a rule of adding on to Shabbat equally would apply to the 7th year, to Shemitah. So don't work the land even before the 7th year. How much is discussed in the Mishnah. But my point is that according to this view, this verse of working 6 yamim and resting on the 7th is referring not to Shabbat, but refers to Shemitah. If that be the case, then we have another example of Shemitah found in the Torah. And I would add to that if in fact one reads this verse as referring to Shemitah, personally, it strikes me that the plain meaning of the text is Shabbat and not Shemitah. But the very fact that the Talmud makes the suggestion, and Rashi brings it as one opinion, would reinforce the significance of Shemitah. Because remember, Shemitah is found towards the very end of the book of the Covenant, which is basically a continuation of sorts of the 10 Commandments. And in chapter 34, after the golden calf, the Torah is repeating for us some of the commandments, such as no idolatry, and then the festivals where you go and encounter God. So the idea of taking the pilgrimage and encountering God. And in the midst of not worshiping foreign gods and having the pilgrimage to encounter Hashem, right in the middle of that, the Torah added the Law of Shemitah. That would certainly reinforce for us the idea that we saw last week, that Shemitah is not just any mitzvah, but that Shemitah is actually a covenantal mitzvah. I'll come back to that theme in a few minutes, about Shemitah being the covenantal mitzvah. What's interesting here, to add one point, and then I'll stop for comments or questions, is that you shall work for 6 days, and the 7th you shall rest, during plowing season and harvest season. If we presume, let's assume that it's Shemitah for now. But what's interesting is the very next verse is discussing the holiday of Shavuot. V'chag Shavuot haseh lecha bikurei katzir chitim. You shall observe the festival of Shavuot, festival of weeks. And of course, we know the festival of weeks is about 7 weeks after the beginning of Pesach, which was the preceding rule before the 6 Yamim. So the interesting thing is that if it refers to Shemitah, the very next verse talks about the festival of Shavuot of the 7 weeks. And we know that and we'll get to this shortly, that when it comes to the 7 weeks, the Torah tells us there's an obligation to count 7 weeks. So we also know there's an obligation to count 7 Shemitot. And we'll get to that in just a few moments. So this perhaps, if it does refer to Shemitah, personally, I don't think that's the plain meaning of the Torah, but if one takes that point of view, it is striking that first of all, Shemitah is here altogether. And secondly, that it appears in the Torah immediately preceding the festival of Shavuot. And we'll shortly see and discuss a bit the connection between Shavuot and Shemitah. But before we continue, I'll stop for a moment. Are there any comments or questions someone wants to speak up or in the chat, I'll be happy to try to respond.
Also, if you're on Facebook Live, feel free to ask any questions.
If not, we'll just continue, but feel free to question or comment. Okay, there are no comments at this point, so then more questions, and we'll just continue. And what I wanted to continue with, of course, the main text of Shemitah, of course, is Vayikra chapter 25. And there are many interesting elements when it comes to Shemitah in the 25th chapter of Vayikra. And one of them is that in chapter 25 of Vayikra, it begins with Shemitah. It begins with the seventh year is Shabbat Hashem, a Shabbat unto God. A Shabbat unto God. Shemitah is called Shabbat. Let's start with that. It's called Shabbat. And again, the Torah says that you may sow the field for 6 years, prune your vineyards, gather the yield of the field. But in the seventh year, Uvashna Shvi'it, Shabbaton Yelo Aretz Shabbat Lashem. So this we saw last week. And it's very striking, not just that Shemitah is called Shabbat, it's even called Shabbat, Shabbaton, Sabbath of Sabbaths. But the way the Torah describes it, actually, it puts it in terms of Shanat Shabbaton Yeh La'aretz, that the land will observe Shabbat. It personifies the land. The land is observing Shabbat. So it's not just that the person observes Shabbat every week, but the land observes Shabbat every year. And we recall that later in chapter 26, we have the admonition, the tochacha, the punishment of exile is the land will make up its Sabbath years, the years that it didn't rest. So it puts it in terms of the very striking term, Shabbat Hashem. And the idea that Shemitah is tied to Shabbat has all kinds of other interesting implications. Maybe we'll touch upon a couple of them later tonight. But the point over here is, apart from the rule of Shemitah, that every 7 years you don't work the land, and that we already saw in chapter 23 of Exodus. The Torah there said, don't work the land, leave it for the poor person and for the animals. So you share it with the poor people and the animals, right? That's what it said in chapter 20. Here too, if we scroll down, keep scrolling down and keep going, and it describes what not working the land. That's what it says here in chapter 5. It said in the book of Exodus, you shall abandon the land. Here it talks about not reaping and not harvesting, etc. And that in verse number 5, Vayta Shabbat Aretz Lachem Liachla L'cha Li'avdecha V'Lamotecha. Here it describes that the land shall be for you to eat, together with your servants and your hired laborers and those that dwell together with you. So the Shemitah here, the land is what we call hefker, basically. The land is there for public use. You also can take from it, but you know more than anybody else. That's what it says in verse number 6, okay? That's verse 6. Keep scrolling down. And then we see in the next verses, and the animals eat as well. The domesticated animals and the wild animals eat as well. And now we have verse number 8. V'sofarta lecha sheva shabtot shanim, sheva shanim sheva pamim. V'ayu lecha yemei sheva shabtot hashanim, teisha v'arba'im shana. We have a new rule over here. It's very striking. You are to count, says the Torah, Sheva Shabtot Shanim. Here they translate 7 weeks of years. It means 7 years. 7 years, 7 times. And the number of the sabbatical years is 49. In other words, there is 7, let's call it 7 weeks. 7 years it calls weeks, Shabbatot. Shabbat is a period of time, ends with Shabbat. Normally it's days, but over here it's years. So you're counting 7 years, 7 times, the 7th year 7 times, and you're also counting 49 years. So there's a mitzvah one say to count. And what are you counting towards? And then the next verse, there's a new rule we never encountered before. It says V'avarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi'i be'asor hachodesh b'yom ha'kippurim taviru shofar b'chol artzachem. So you are to sound the shofar trua in the 7th month, but not on the 1st day of the month, but on the 10th day, which is Yom Kippur, and you shall have the shofar sounded throughout the land. And the next verse, B'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim shana, you are to sanctify the 50th year. You are to proclaim freedom or liberty throughout the land. And this year is called the Yovel, Jubilee. It shall be a Jubilee year. Jubilee is simply Yovel. V'shavtem isha achuzato, v'isha mishpachto toshuvu. And in this year, everybody shall return both to their possessions and to their family. And the Torah continues to explain what that means. This is the Yovel, the Jubilee year. Keep scrolling down. Yovel hi, next verse. Yovel hi, shnat ha'chamishim shana tiyeh lachem, lo tizra'u, lo tiktzeru et tzvichecha, lo tivtzeru et zirecha, ki yovel hi, kodesh tiyeh lachem, min hasadeh tochlu et tvuata, b'shnat ha'yovel hazot toshuvu isha lachuzato. The 50th year is a jubilee. You can't work the fields. That sounds very similar to Shemitah. And the Torah says, for it is a jubilee year, kodesh tiyeh lachem. It shall be holy for you. You shall eat none of the produce that the field produces, right? In other words, you can eat from the field, but only eat the growth from the field, directly from the field. You're not working the field. And in this Jubilee year, everyone returns ish elachuzato. Here they translate to one's holdings, one's property, and the Torah will spell it out, that the stei achuzah, the family field that you have, returns to you during the Jubilee year. Now, let us begin. This Jubilee year is, let's put it this way. If you step back for a moment and think about this, it's actually an astonishing idea. An astonishing idea. We'll get to that later. But before we get to the astonishing idea of the Jubilee year, I wanted to just note the parallel here between the counting of the 7 years and 7 times 7, the 50th year being Kodesh, being a holy year, right? Torah calls it Kodesh, holy. And the parallel, this is chapter 25 of Vayikra. And there's a very striking parallel that appears 2 chapters earlier. And it's chapter 23. So let's take a look for a moment at Vayikra, chapter 23, which is the parallel. And that's found in chapter 23 of Vayikra, beginning in verse number 15. Chapter 23, Vayikra, verse number 15. The chapter 23 deals with the various holidays. So it mentions first the Shabbat, the first holiday, in the beginning of 23. And then after an introduction, these are the festivals. The first festival is Pesach, of course. And the year of holidays starts with Pesach, first month. Torah calls Pesach, the month of Pesach, the first month. And then the Torah says, when you come into the land, when you come into the land and you harvest the fields, you shall bring a sacrifice to the Kohen. That sacrifice is called the Omer. So after it describes Pesach, it talks about the Omer. You shall bring the Omer. And famously, the Torah says the Omer is brought the day after Shabbat. Day after Shabbat. Fine. And then it says in verse number 15, Usfartem lachem mimacharata Shabbat, miyom aviachem et Omer hatnufa, sheva Shabbatot tmimot tiyena. So we are to count from the day after Shabbat. Let's go now with the rabbinic understanding that Shabbat means Pesach. Torah does call it Shabbat, but let's assume Pesach for our purposes. You count out, says the Torah, 7 weeks. Sheva Shabbatot is 7 weeks, whole weeks. Until you complete the counting of the 7 weeks, you count 50 days. That is to say, the 50th day will be a special day, upon which you bring a sacrifice. Now we scroll down some more, and now the Torah says, what is this 50th day? So after it talks about the sacrifices of the day, you bring two breads that you're going to bring. Torah calls them bikurim, right? Bikurim Hashem, and then it describes the sacrifice further in the next verse, in verse number, was it 18? And we keep scrolling down, and you bring another sacrifice, keep going down, keep scrolling down. Ukratem bi'etzem, verse 21. And on this day that you bring all these special sacrifices, the 50th day, Mikra Kodesh Yelachem, this is a holy day. It's a holy day. Do no labor. This is a rule for all time. And then the Torah added a very strange thing in verse number 22. And when you harvest your field, do not completely harvest the field, and do not gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the stranger, for the poor person. I am the Lord your God. So what is this about? What is this 50th day after the Omer? So the 50th day, of course, as we know it, is the holiday of Shavuot, Chag HaShavuot. And Chag HaShavuot, the Torah says, is you count out 7 weeks, and you're also counting out the days. Tispru Chamishim Yom, Torah says you count 50 days, 49 days, the 50th day being Shavuot. So here we have a very striking parallel between Sfirat HaOmer, which is chapter 23, the counting of the weeks and the days. And at the end of this cycle, you have a day which is Kodesh. It's a holy day. The holiness of the day is exemplified by the sacrifices that are brought, big special sacrifices. And then the Torah said the strangest thing. In verse number 20, I think it's 22, that when you harvest your field, don't completely harvest it. Leave up. And what's strange is, first of all, this verse, by the way, appeared earlier in Vayikra, in chapter 19. But what's strange is, this is a list of the festivals. And this particular mitzvah of when you harvest your field, to leave some for the poor, has nothing to do with the holiday of Shavuot. It's a general mitzvah. But for whatever reason, the Torah included this mitzvah in the section in which it talks about Shavuot. In other words, when you look at the festivals in Vayikra, when it discusses Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, there it mentions sitting in a sukkah. There it mentions taking the lulav and the etrog, etc. When it talks about Rosh Hashanah, sounding the shofar, Yom Kippur, fasting, those are things you do on those days. But over here, when it comes to Shavuot, the Torah does include a mitzvah, but it's not, it would appear, it's not something you do on Shavuot or don't do on Shavuot. It would appear that the Torah has dafka connected Shavuot to this particular mitzvah, even though the particular observance of not reaping the entire field, but leaving a portion for the poor and the stranger, that's all year round. But apparently, the Torah wanted to include that when it talks about Shavuot. So what do we make of that, and why is it relevant to our study? So I believe, and I'll take comments or questions after this, that what the Torah is saying is, what is this holiday of Shavuot? You're counting out the days. You're counting out the weeks. And in point of fact, what it seems to be is that you're counting it out from the holiday of Pesach. Pesach is the holiday of freedom. We were slaves in Mitzrayim, and we were redeemed from Egypt. For what purpose? What is the purpose of the redemption? So from these verses, it would appear that the purpose of the redemption was to possess the land. Now, in rabbinic thought, the holiday of Shavuot is identified with receiving the Torah, that the purpose of leaving Egypt was to receive the Torah. That's the rabbinic understanding of it. But in the plain reading of the Chumash, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds what you celebrate on Shavuot is possession of the land. Even the sacrifice that's brought, a sacrifice of bread, which is very unusual. Torah usually forbids chametz in any sacrifice. On the festival of Shavuot is permitted, because what it's actually about is a full possession of the land. That's what we're celebrating. That's the biblical, the Torah's way of presenting. That's how the Torah presents the holiday of Shavuot. So you leave Egypt with the aspiration of possessing a land, and that's the idea of counting. And the idea of the 50th day, after you count the cycles of weeks and days, you come to the 50th day, and that's the day of sacrifices. And that's the demonstration that it's God's land. And on the practical plane of it, what does it mean to say that it's God's land? Well, if it's God's land, then in a certain sense, you have no more providence over the land than anybody else. It's not really yours. And that's the very striking verse that's been imported into the Shavuot description of when you harvest your field, don't harvest it all. And notice the very interesting expression, leave it for the stranger and the poor person. Torah did not say here, give it. The Torah says, leave it, as if the Torah is saying, it's not yours. Don't consider it you're giving the poor person something. Not at all. What the holiday of Shavuot represents is when God gives us the land, that's on the condition of understanding that it's really not ours. We have the use of the land, that's true. But the land is God's land, and therefore leave it, tazov, abandon it. Abandon, azov is to abandon. The word Shemitah means to abandon. And now if we think about this verse, and we think about chapter 25, the laws of Shemitah, then it would appear to be precisely this. You're counting out the 7 years, 7 times 7, which is parallel to the 7 weeks over here. And the 50th year is parallel to the 50th day, which is Shavuot, which is a holiday which celebrates the fact that God has given us God's land, but it's God's land. And then when you get to the chapter 25, to the Yovel, what does the Torah say? The Torah says that in the Jubilee year, the lands revert back to their original owners, and the slaves go free. Slaves go free. So it means that fundamentally, and the Torah, it says why that should be. Why should that be the case that the slaves go free? Why should it be the case that the land reverts back to the original owners. So in chapter 25, let's find that verse. Where is it in chapter 25? 1 second. Chapter 25, let's see.
13, 14.
Chapter 25, 13 and 14. That is true, but there's another even more explicit verse. Here it is. Chapter 25, verse number 23. You may not sell the land in perpetuity, means forever, beyond reclaim. The verse actually could mean one of two things. You shouldn't sell it forever. That's one possibility. And the other possibility is you can't sell it forever. You don't have that right. Why not? Because it's not yours. Ki li haaretz, the earth is mine, says God. Ki gerim v'toshavim atem imodi. You are merely strangers and residents with me. And therefore, in the land of your possession, uv'chol eretz achuzatchem, geulat titnu la'aretz, bring redemption to the land.
And
Once
Rabbi
again,
Silber,
yes,
and in Chavav, in Lamed Bet, it's talking about V'shamamu aleha oivechem hayoshvim ba. They also have to release the land.
that's right. The point is that, right, the point is that in this section over here, it's very striking, the parallel to Shavuot. They actually cast a light upon Shavuot. If the land is not yours, I would say it's it's yours to the extent that you realize it's not yours. It's God's land. And this is true of the land. And it's also equally true of slavery. The slaves go free in the Jubilee year. And the Torah gives a reason for that. The reason is given later in this chapter. It says, God says, Avodai heim asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. These people are my servants, literally my slaves, that I took out of the land of Egypt. They're not yours. So the slave in this chapter over here, the Hebrew slave at least, in this chapter over here, is someone that worked for you for a certain period of time. It's interesting that in this chapter, back in the book of Shemot we saw last week, the Torah says that the male slave works maximally 6 years, and the 7th year goes free. It's interesting that in chapter 25 of Vayikra, it doesn't mention going free after 6 years. Maybe the Torah presumes that. It talks about going free in the Jubilee year, whenever the Jubilee year happens to occur. In other words, it could be that 3 years after you purchase the slave is the Yovel, and then the slave would go free after 3 years. And the Torah in Vayikra, Kaf Hey, doesn't mention 6 years. But the idea of it is the same, both in terms of the land and in terms of the slave. It's not yours. The land is mine, says God, and these people are mine. I took them out of Egypt. So therefore, Avodayim, I took them out to serve me. That's what the Torah say. That was the purpose of the Exodus, to serve me. They're my avodim. So they're not really your avodim. Okay, we didn't eliminate the Eved Ivri completely, but fundamentally he's a worker. He's a time-bound worker. And the Jubilee year frees the slave and frees the land. And in thinking about this, and this is all new, that what the Torah may be saying is that even the Shemitah years, Shemitah is important in and of itself, but Shemitah can also be seen as aspirational, as moving towards the idea of counting the Shemitah, like counting the days before Shavuot, is thinking about or aspiring to or wanting to reach Shavuot. And Shavuot, of course, is an expression of the fact that it's God's land. we are permitted to dwell in God's land if we behave ourselves. And now the Shemitah and the Yovel are the parallels. So we can think about it this way, and then I'll stop and take comments and questions or whatever. We should think about it this way, that in these chapters, starting with chapter 23, you have the Sabbath of the days every week. The seventh day of the week is Shabbat. And then you have, I would say that I think you have the Sabbath of the months. The seventh month is special. Why is the seventh month special? Because there we have the festival of Yom Kippur and of Sukkot, and Rosh Hashanah is important in the plain reading of the Torah, because Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the special month. And the shofar you sound, the Chumash doesn't mention the shofar, but true or whatever, is probably, I think, in the Pshat, an announcement that the holy days are coming. The holy days being Yom Kippur, and the holy days being Sukkot. Those are really the holidays of Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah gets its significance by way of introduction to the two core holidays of the Chumash, which together with Pesach is Sukkot and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah may partake of both of those days. And that's probably the reason that, and we'll maybe discuss this as well, that the slaves going free in the Yovel and the lands returning to their owners in the Yovel, the shofar is sounded not on Rosh Hashanah, not on the first day of the month, but the shofar is sounded, says the Torah, on the 10th day of the month. Yom HaKippurim taviu shofar b'chol artzachem. So there's some kind of connection between Yovel and Yom Kippur. But my point is, this is all new. The idea of seeing Shemitah as a gateway towards the Yovel. That's what you have in chapter 25. And the Yovel takes on a very deep significance. The Shemitah is basically Shabbos. It's holy because it's Shabbos. That's one reason it's holy. But it may be holy for another reason. It may be holy because it leads up to the Yovel. You're counting the 7 Shemitah to get to the Yovel. And I'll just make one comment more, and then I'll take the comments or questions, which is that what's interesting is the Torah called the Jubilee year, the Yovel, Kodesh. It's holy. And you take the food from the fields. You don't work the fields. You live off the field. Minasodeh, you with the stranger, with the poor person, with the animals, etc. And the Torah called the Jubilee year holy, but it never called the Shemitah year holy. So is the Shemitah year holy or not holy? The rabbinic understanding of it is that it is holy, that the produce of the Shemitah year, and this is very striking actually in the Mishnah and the Gemara, that the produce of the Shemitah is holy. The produce is holy. We'll discuss that as well. So if we ask me the question, why is Shemitah, if we think of Shemitah as Kodesh, which is how the Gemara and the Mishnah seem to take it, where is that Kedusha coming from? I would say 2 sources. One is Shabbos. Shabbos is the holy day, and Shemitah is the Shabbos. Shabbos Hashem. But it's perhaps also deriving its sanctity from another place, which is the Yovel. After all, the Torah says that some of the rules of Shemitah apply during Yovel, and some other rules apply as well. You're not permitted to work the land during the Jubilee year, the same way you can't work it during the Shemitah year. So the prohibition to work the land is what makes that food of that year holy. Holiness is typically bound up with restrictions. One of the major components of Kedusha is restriction. So the Shemitah, the Kedusha of the Shemitah, then, the 2 possible sources, I think both are probably right. It derives it from its being a Shabbat. It derives it from its being a kind of mini Yovel. Different from Yovel, but similar in some respects. Let me stop at this point. Are there any comments or questions about anything that we discussed so far?
That simultaneously Hashem is ridding the land of the people, of the Oivim. So it's also making it free to be possessed and to be formed by the people after the Shemitah, meaning it's an assistance to the Am Yisrael too.
Well, the Oivim are only there if we misbehave. I mean, the Oivim are, we'll get to that about the enemies, and that touches on another point about Shemitah, which is very important, and the Talmud picked it up, but it's actually something unique to Shemitah, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. I did want to, since Rosie made a comment, I wanted to come back to something that she's mentioned last week, which is important about the Shemitah's place in the covenantal description of chapter 26. Because there are two covenants in the Torah. There's the covenant here in which the Shemitah plays a role, and that's related to the covenant of Sinai. But then there's another covenant in the Torah at the end of the Chumash, covenant of the plains of Moab, and there the mitzvah that's singled out is not Shemitah. There the mitzvah that's singled out is actually Bikurim. And I wanted to talk about that, more about Shemitah, but what are the implications of Shemitah being this covenantal mitzvah? And there's certain interesting implications that we'll get to. Is there anybody else who has something to say?
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
it's a small note. It's the parallel language between the description of Shavuot in chapter 23 and then the description of Yovel in 25. For Shavuot in 23, 21, we have Ukratem be'etzem hayom hazeh mikra kodesh. So there's a declaration of this day for Shavuot, which is a little strange, but it's Kratem and in Kodesh. And then for the Yovel in 25:10, we have the same words, but in reverse order. The Kidashtem et Shnat HaChamishim Shana Ukratem Dror. So there's this Kodesh and Dror.
I don't know what to make of the inversion there, but the parallel is clear. I mean, I think that unlike the Shemitah, because the Shemitah, you wouldn't have a declaration for the simple reason Shemitah Shabbos. And Shabbos is automatic. Shabbos comes every 7 days. When it comes to the festivals, there we speak about Mikra Kodesh. There we talk about Beit Din being the Kadesh, the month, and determining which day is the Kadesh Yisrael Vazmanim. We mentioned, and our Nusach is Mekadesh Shabbos without Yisrael Shabbos. So that's a good point. That's a further parallel between them. Let me get to anybody else. Thank you for that comment. It's interesting. Of the inversion is interesting.
Is there any connection at all to an attempt at recreation of Gan Eden in that Yovel is sort of the ultimate attempt at getting back in the real world?
That's an excellent point. That is actually an excellent point. I think there's a very profound point that Chaim is making. And I'll actually, let me directly, because it actually segues into what I was going to say next about Shemitah. What's interesting about Shemitah, actually, I mean, there's several interesting features to Shemitah, and part of the reason I wanted to teach this little 4-session is because, Shemitah is difficult to keep. We'll get to that, but I think it's important to take note of the fact that the Torah sees Shemitah not as another mitzvah, sees Shemitah as something very central. And the Torah in 2 different places makes the point that Shemitah is difficult to observe. Usually the Torah does not go out of its way to stress how difficult it is to observe a mitzvah. But when it comes to Shemitah specifically, it does make this point. For example, we have it in chapter 25, verse number 20. It says, V'chi tomru, chapter 25, verse 20. V'chi tomru, you will say, Ma nochal b'shana hashvi'it, how can we eat? Hein lo nizra, v'lo nesel v'tzvuotenu, if we're not permitted to plant the crops and gather in the crops, how are we going to survive? And remember, if you don't plant in the 7th year, you won't have in the next year either. It's not just the 7th year. So how can we function this way? Right? So the Torah says, don't worry about it. I'll command my blessing, says God, in the 6th year. And it will produce enough food for 3 years. So for the 6th year, for the 7th year, and for the 8th year, we'll have enough. And some commentaries say that this question comes up not only after the Shemitah year, but after the Yovel has been mentioned. Because if you presume the Yovel is the 50th year, and the Jubilee year has the same laws as the Shemitah year, means you're not working the field for 2 consecutive years, not just 1 year. So the Torah says, don't worry about it. I'll bless you for 3 years. So some explain why 3, because it includes even the Jubilee year. When the Jubilee year comes, you have 2 consecutive years where you don't work the field. So here the Torah says, people are going to say it's too difficult to observe Shemitah. That's in verse number 20. And what is striking is the following, and this will be a separate session. But actually, in the book of Devarim, it mentions Shemitah twice. But the first time, it says, every 7 years you observe the Shemitah. And this is the Shemitah. And actually, in Devarim, it doesn't mention the land at all. Nothing about the land. It talks about how debts become canceled in the 7th year, what's called Shmitat Ksafim. A fascinating halacha. We'll get to that either next week or in 2 weeks. And there, the point is, let's say I lend you money. So at the end, if you can't pay me back, so the end of the 7th year, to the end of the 7th year, the debt is canceled. So the Torah says, the debt is canceled. I lend you money, and let's say Shemitah is coming in a year or 2 years, or even in 5 years. So the problem is, why would I lend you money? I'm going to lend you money, but maybe you won't be able to pay me, but you won't pay me back. And once the sabbatical year comes, I'm going to lose my money, right? So the Torah says the following. Torah says, let's find this verse. It's in chapter 15 of Devarim, verse number 9. Be very careful. Don't have bad thoughts. You'll say to yourself, Shemitah is not so far away. And you'll look unfavorably upon the poor person, and you won't lend them the money because you're afraid he won't be able to pay you back. And he will cry out to God because he can't get a loan. Give him the money. Take your chances. God will bless you. So it's very striking. The Torah has 2 radically different ideas related to Shemitah. It would appear that one has nothing to do with the other. Maybe we'll talk about that. They're radically different. One is working the land, and one is lending money. In the case of lending money, in the sabbatical year, the debt is canceled. And in both of those cases, the Torah says, we know it's difficult. In the case of the land, don't say, how can we keep this mitzvah? It's impossible to keep it. What are we going to eat? Don't worry. I'll bless you. I'll give you a blessing, says God. And we have a parallel, virtually identical problem when it comes to Shemitah Ksafim. Why should I lend this guy money? In 2 years at Shemitah. And he's a poor person. Be able to pay me back. Says God, don't worry about it. Whether he pays you back or not, I'm going to bless you. So if he doesn't pay you back, I'll bless you. So don't worry about it. Yes, there's a good chance he won't pay you back. So what you see from the Torah, it's very interesting. And you have this in the Gemara in spades, actually. That actually, Shemitah is difficult to keep. And many people won't keep it, actually. Not just it's difficult to keep, but many people will not observe this mitzvah. And that's why, for example, in the Gemara, we have what's called the Pruzbol, where Hillel set up a mechanism to collect the money after Shemitah. Mechanism. you turn your debts over to the court, and the court is allowed to dun the other person to demand payment. The individual can't demand payment. So Hillel instituted this prusbo, which would appear to be, on one hand, counter to the Torah. Torah says, lend them money and don't worry about it. But apparently people were not lending money. So Hillel maybe violates, in a sense, the letter of the law, but keeps the spirit of the law, because he wants the poor people to get a loan. It's for the benefit of the poor. The prusbo benefits the poor person. This way the poor person can get a loan. Now, let me just make one other comment about, so this is interesting. And by the way, to this very day, Shemitah is difficult to observe. The reason Shemitah is a fascinating topic is because basically it's a real challenge to halacha, because in point of fact, Shemitah today is not really observed. I mean, it's observed in the breach. That is to say, let's say in the land of Israel, there's a legal fiction by which the land is sold to non-Jews. And so non-Jews don't have to observe the Shemitah, so I can buy the produce from the non-Jews. Because the problem with Shemitah, I just want to make this point, the problem with Shemitah is not just the prohibition of working the land. The problem of Shemitah is that you're not allowed to eat the produce that was produced by working the land. That's where the major problem of Shemitah comes up. The produce is forbidden to eat. So to get around that, the produce of a Jew is forbidden to eat, but the produce of a non-Jew is permissible to eat. So in Israel, 98% of the people get around it by either assuming that the land of Israel itself is sold to non-Jews, a legal fiction, or they actually purchase food from non-Jews. They'll import from Europe or from Asia or wherever. So they're not really observing Shemitah, because if we were truly to observe the Shemitah, it would be very, very difficult. And the difficulty of Shemitah, and for some people think the impossibility of observing Shemitah, I'm not saying it is impossible, but many people think of it as impossible. And especially in a global economy, if you're not producing your food and selling it to your customers one year, they're not going to come back to you. They'll find other suppliers. So the point is, the difficulty of Shemitah is found already in the Chumash and the Gemara. Gemara understands it. Gemara knows many examples of people that don't observe it, which makes it, I think, doubly troubling, or certainly raises a huge question when people say today it's too difficult to observe it. A response would be, we know it's difficult, the Torah said it, but do it anyway. You have to remember, by the way, that in the Chumash, just as a side point, in the Chumash, in the book of Devarim, which talks about the cancellation of debts, you have to remember, and this is a very important point, it's not like nowadays when you get a loan from a bank, because basically what one of the main, if not the main, factor in the Western economy, the American economy, relates to the stock market. The most important thing to know is what is the interest rates. Interest rates are very low, so that affects housing. It affects the stock market. The stock market will go up because you have no place to put your money. Basically, get 1%, 0.5%. Interest rates are the main determinant, probably the main determinant in the Western economy. The Torah has no interest rates. The Torah forbids taking interest. I'm lending you money. I get no benefit from that. Nowadays, it's the opposite. The banks don't want to lend money to poor people. They want to lend money to rich people. You have to prove that you have to prove you owe the loan to get the loan, basically. That's today. But in the Chumash, that's not the case. In the Chumash, there's no benefit. In the Chumash, lending money basically is one word, which is tzedakah. And Rambam thinks the highest form of charity, giving the person dignity, self-sufficiency, and all that. On the other hand, there's no incentive for a person to lend the money. So we understand why somebody might say, "Why should I lose my money?" It's one thing if I'm getting some interest, some financial benefit from the loan, but there is no benefit in the Torah. So the Torah, this is a very important point. Now we're going to have to wait for Chaim's point, which is a central point over here. Shemitah is a mitzvah that's difficult to keep. And actually, it's Chaim's point and it's Rosie's point. I want to get to the 2 points will be the main subject of the shir, because I want to suggest, and I think we have this already in the Ramban, that the Torah itself understands very well that this idea of Shemitah is a kind of mitzvah for a kind of ideal world. It's not really perfectly, doesn't fit in perfectly to the world in which we live, which is why the mitzvah over here in Vayikra, which speaks of the earth is God's, the land is God's, it's God's land, we are simply strangers in the land, it's not ours, it's not your land. And that's where Shemitah comes in. But in the book of Devarim, when we get to the covenant of Devarim, the covenantal mitzvah is not Shemitah. The covenantal mitzvah there is Bikurim. And the reason for that, I think, is Bikurim is different. Bikurim is land that I worked. It's my land, actually. In Shemitah, it's about abandoning. Shemitah is to abandon. It's not really yours. As we saw in Shavuos, leave it for the poor person. It doesn't say give it to the poor person, because it's not yours to give. You have rights inside, it's God's land. Okay, God's, I'll give you 80%, but 20% leave, or the corner, whatever. But the book of Devarim is completely different. The book of Devarim is God is up in heaven. It's our land. It's our system of justice. It's our king. It's our judges. The book of Devarim is setting up your own society. So there, it's more about me giving somebody my stuff. It's not that it's not mine to begin with. It is mine. But there, the obligation is, it is mine. I own it. But nonetheless, or maybe dafka, I'm responsible to give and to share with others. It's about sharing with others what's mine. So the book, if this be true, and I think it is very true, I wanted to try to demonstrate next week, and Shemitah is about a world in which everything belongs to God. Chaim called it Gan Eden, and that was a very appropriate description, actually, right on target, I think. And that's the world of Shemitah. And that's one of the reasons, I think, that the rabbinic tradition understands how difficult Shemitah is. And over the course of time, it's been difficult to keep it. And that's why all kinds of legal fictions, Prusbo is one of them, and nowadays other legal fictions have been set up, Rav Kook's, Heter Mechira, and all that. Now, is that the best path to go? Is a very good question. I think it's problematic from a certain standpoint, but we can talk about that next week. So next week, I didn't want to pick up these 2 comments about the contrast to Devarim on one hand, and the ideal nature of Shemitah on the other, and its difficulty. And the Gan Eden expression I think, is very much on point, as we'll see next week. And then the last session, I did want to deal with Devarim with the cancellation of debts, Shmitat Ksafim, which applies, by the way, throughout the world. It's not only in the land of Israel. The Shemitah on the land is only in Israel, but the cancellation of debts applies to every place, not only in. So we'll discuss that in 2 weeks. Next week, we'll deal with the question of the ideal nature of Shemitah in the Chumash. Are there any comments or questions? And I will, remember, you can always send me questions in my email, dsilber@risha.org. So
Rabbi Wolfish spoke about that with the Gan Eden concept. A lot of people,
he went into that. Did he spoke in terms of the Chumash? He spoke about it.
Yeah, he discussed the Gan Eden as one theory from some of the Mefarshim, but also Rabbi Kook.
Well, I'll show you. It's actually in the Torah itself, I believe.
Yeah, but Rav Kook also, there were many stories. I remember how he regretted that particular move that he made.
That could be, but regret or not, that is the dominant way that we deal with it. I don't want to minimize the difficulties of Shemitah. In other words, the difficulties are an individual person can find other ways. It's not impossible for an individual person to observe Shemitah as the Torah says it. The difficulty with Shemitah actually is not on the individual level. The difficulty with Shemitah is when you get to the national level. When you're talking about national level, dealing with other nations, exporting, importing. If you don't export your food for a year, or probably for a month or two, you're going to lose the entire market because nobody cares. They're going to go elsewhere. And once they go elsewhere, they have a new supplier. So there are on the communal level, it's difficult to observe, and that's why Rav Kook's. I mean, has anybody come up with a better answer for the community? That's the question. I have not yet. One could say we'll observe it, and the chips will fall where they may. As difficult as it is, that's a valid position. Okay, it's difficult. You're going to suffer. True. The Torah said that already. But you have to have faith. God bless you, says God. But if you have the faith, that's one thing. But most governments don't have that kind of faith. So on the communal level, it's observed in the breach. It's not really observed today on a communal level. But that raises another question about how it should be observed. In other words, do you lose the idea of Shemitah even though you don't keep Shemitah? Maybe the idea of Shemitah can be implemented. And that was the position of Eliezer Berkowitz, which I think is not the topic of these sessions, but it's a very interesting topic. Let me stop at this point. That's just to tell everybody who doesn't know, I'm in Israel.
Yeah, it's 4 o'clock in the morning.
Given between 3 and 4 in the morning, my time.
I know.
It's not simple. I've done crazy stuff, but it was a mistake, but I'm happy to do it. But it's now time for me to go to sleep.
Let's hope.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, so, all right. So we'll
Toda.
send me the questions in the email and hope to see you next week. Thank you.